geoscience, being able to, for many in geoscience, sort of working with all this data, I would argue is the main challenge currently. And it will just be an even bigger challenge in the future. Hold on. Sorry. That's weird. Sorry about that. So traditionally, what we would do, and what I've done for much of my career, is just download the data and start working on it, right? That works fine for megabytes. Also works fine for gigabytes. You know, it gets pretty painful for terabytes. And once you sort of approach the petabyte range, it's just really not feasible anymore. This sort of model of bringing the data to the compute just doesn't work anymore. And this is sort of the range that we are currently, as an earth science community, are sitting at, and many other science communities are also approaching or have already exceeded this sort of scale. And even on a fast internet connection, really you end up spending days or weeks just to download that data, if you even have that much local storage. So clearly, this has not been just a problem since yesterday, and so people have come around sort of some solutions for this. But what many people have done is create these so-called data fortresses. I really like this term. It was termed by Shel Gentman. And so how that works, for instance, an example, like let's take Columbia University here. And so I have access to many large data sets on the HPC system of Columbia, where sort of they mirror many of these popular data sets that the scientists in that institution need. And then basically you have like a big supercomputer, and so many institutions work like that. They have their own sort of infrastructure, and for people who are in the system, this works really well. But this has really several downsides that are absolutely major, right? It's a real barrier to collaboration. You need a user account or need to be part of the institution. Depending on which data fortress you're talking about, there's some that's easier to get in as an outside collaborator, some that are really, really badly hidden behind sort of requirements, and depending on where you're from, it might be impossible to get in there. And yeah, really the big thing is like nobody without an account on these systems can reproduce any of my results that I created there. And data fortresses are also incredibly expensive, and thus inherently exclude many scientists and stakeholders that do not work at a rich institution like Columbia University and other rich institutions. I really truly believe this is a fundamental barrier, not only to making science more equitable as sort of an afterthought, but really I believe that sort of more perspective from everyone around the world, more diverse perspectives on science will always make it better. And then finally, this model is really incredibly wasteful, if you think about it, both in terms of resources and in terms of money, especially as sort of the amount of mirrored data sets grows. So how can we do it better? Well, there's sort of this general paradigm shift, bring the compute to the data. And I think that we can potentially solve many of these problems that way. But that's a really general statement. And it's really sort of, I think the interesting things really come up when you ask how we can actually implement this. One way of doing this is use some sort of pre-made platform. There's many out there, and sort of maybe one of the most prominent examples that almost everyone knows is Google Earth. But there's definitely many other examples. But I actually, however, argue that there are way too many inherent issues with these sort of platforms and most of them share one or some of these at least. Many platforms put limitations on how users can interact with the data. I find that in science, there's often no real standard analysis. And I think in most fields that's true, like flexibility is key for innovative approaches. It's also a question who controls the data sets available. A big part of many people's day-to-day science life, at least in my field, is to combine insights from many different data sets, let it be different models or models and observations. And really the scientific knowledge comes out of combining these data sets. And if you don't have access to the data sets you want, that really is a burden to creating scientific knowledge. And then finally, platforms really increase the risk of lock-in of academic research, which means that like one entity, one company basically sort of is able to control the cost of people doing research. And I think we can all agree that that should be avoided at all costs. So how would an alternative look like? So I'm presenting here sort of the idea of like what PANGEO thinks an open cloud architecture should look like. And this really enables scientists to combine their compute environments with data in the cloud and interact with it from wherever they are and basically with minimal resources like your personal laptop. How your compute interacts with the data is really flexible. We've had great successes using Jupyter as a base for interactive computing, and that sort of gives you choice between different open source languages. Python, Julia, R have been implemented, but I think the system is generally open and flexible enough to implement others. On the compute side of things, several frameworks are available to parallelize and scale workflows. In the PANGEO community, we had a lot of good experiences with Dask, but many other use cases are also supported. On the data side of things, we emphasize the use of ARCO data. ARCO stands for Analysis Ready Cloud Optimized Data. I'll talk about this in the sort of final slides of the talk, but in short, these are data formats that play well with Cloud Object Store, and in many cases interface with higher level tools like Xarray, so the user doesn't have to be an expert in cloud technology to actually use these data. And then finally, we emphasize that all of these components, which are very modular, can be deployed on many different platforms like different cloud providers and even HPC systems, which is pretty effective at preventing lock-in by a specific provider. And you can also support many different workflows and use cases with sort of the same general interoperable software stack. So to sort of quote the vision of that was coined by Fernando Perez as part of the Open Ocean Cloud, is sort of, as an analogy, we want to get rid of the data fortress, we want to build a data watering hole. In this vision, the data is provided easily accessible and users can customize the compute to their needs. And this would support many different fields and use cases from, let's say, different science teams over educators, students, and even industry. And I think this would truly enable reproducible science, which is fast, effective, creative, and equitable, and even fun. If you want to know more about this sort of project, which I just briefly summarized here, I encourage you to check out Open Ocean Cloud and read up more on that. So I've been talking a lot about PANGEO, but I think it's worth actually defining what exactly PANGEO is. I think a lot of people often think of PANGEO as just either a software or a software stack, but I would emphasize that PANGEO is first and foremost a community. It's a community of consists mostly of scientists and software developers trying to make scientific data processing better. A lot of this work is, in fact, expressed in the PANGEO software stack. The stack enables very flexible and efficient workflows on many different types of data and for hopefully different fields. This was motivated by geosciences, but none of this really is prohibiting other fields of science to use these tools and make them even better and more general. And so for my field of science, many of the use cases really revolve around Xarray, which is a great package for abstracting the handling of labeled n-dimensional arrays, but other libraries exist, for instance, pandas that handles unstructured data sets, etc. PANGEO also maintains data and computing infrastructures. These are not long-term funded projects. They're more prototypes for the way science could be done in the future, if you will. I will actually go and demonstrate these next. After a quick emphasis that really, I think there's often a perception that PANGEO is only for earth sciences or only for earth science modelers and not for people who collect observations. And I really just want to emphasize that the emphasis in the community is really on modular and interoperable tools. And it should really be sort of an emphasis that this is sort of nobody is excluded, and sort of these tools are supposed to run on as many platforms and for as many users as possible. As a matter of fact, one of my personal favorite attributes in the last years has actually been sort of the portability of the PANGEO stack. I've personally moved workflows between my laptop on a moving train, and then sort of later on moving to an HPC system and eventually into a cloud environment. And it was surprisingly frictionless. It wasn't completely frictionless, but like I was definitely surprised. It's one of these things that I like to come back to. And yeah, so now I would like to transition to a real world example with the demo at the end that sort of brings these aspects of PANGEO together and sort of shows some of my more recent work. So the data set that we're going to use for that is CMIP6. And this is sort of one of the, let's say, big climate data sets. CMIP stands for Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. And so this is the 6th iteration. It is an internationally coordinated effort to model the future of the Earth system under different scenarios that include emissions and other variables. But they're controlled between different modeling centers that then put out a bunch of different models, runs with have different ensemble members, can have different experiments. And so that really is a big data set that at this point exceeds a petabyte and is still growing. It really presents sort of an invaluable amount of information and things to discover for scientists all around the world. The most common thing sort of in terms of workflow that scientists would want to do is sort of come up with some cool analysis to each of the data sets and then aggregate these and look at the results. This is something you can often see in plots like this that is taken from the IPCC report. So at the sort of most basic level, let's outline how this workflow would look like in an ideal world. Well, first you got to have an idea. And then you run some code to translate your idea to the data. And you get some interesting results, hopefully, interpret and publish them, and you and the community learn something. Well, let's hope you did not have to download the CMIP6 data, because that would have taken a while, and you're using the PANGEO cloud version that is actually was uploaded from the community. Are you now ready to do that, these 3 steps? Not quite, because the CMIP6 data is actually not quite clean enough, and I'll discuss a little bit more about that later. And here just show one of several issues underlined here. You can see that these data sets generally have the same structure, the same dimensionality, but they're just named differently. This is just sort of one of the minor and first things that I noticed when I wanted to work across different data sets within this, this larger collection. Well, it's totally easy enough to fix, right? But at this point, this is not the only thing. There's other things you have to correct, and you probably kind of forgot or it got sort of to the back of your head what you initially wanted to investigate, and a lot of your attention has been captured by boring pre-processing. So there must be a better way for this. And well, there is. So on the one hand, the PANGEO CMIP6 archive in the cloud sort of makes giant amounts of data accessible virtually instantly, just the web browser. And then CMIP6 pre-processing, which I'm the core developer on, attempts to crowdsource these sort of pre-processing fixes to common data cleaning tasks that are specific to this data set. And since rarely anyone works with all the data of this giant archive, this crucially relies on community feedback or peer-to-peer learning, if you want to call it that way. In short, if you work or want to work with this data set, and you should, it's really awesome, the PANGEO tools let you focus on the science and not the data processing. I will now switch over to a live demo. So let's hope this works. Okay. Right, let me get rid of this guy here. Sorry about that. Uh-oh. I think I might have lost my DAS cluster here. That's not great. Well, I can still go through this. We have a little bit of time, right? Okay, so this will take a minute. I originally planned to actually pre-execute this, but I think it got closed over time. That was my bad. Okay, so this was a demo I developed for the atmospheric, the American Meteorological Society meeting. That was a while ago. I need to give me 1 second here to set this up. So nope. Joy of live demos. Okay, so now we have all of the goodies that DAS gives us to demonstrate what we're doing here. Okay, so what I'm doing here is just sort of setting some defaults for plotting. It's not something to worry about that much. But here we're going to start to load and actually clean the data. So the way we're ingesting this is one of several possible options, and I encourage you to go to the online documentation. I can send a link later. There's to check out other options, but what we're doing here is using an intake, a custom intake catalog that basically has all of the ZAR stores that are provided by PANGEO in Google Cloud Storage. And then what I'm doing here is basically selecting a subset of different models. There's way more than these, but for the sake of actually demonstrating here, I'm going to restrict this. I'm also importing this sort of batch combined pre-processing function that we're going to apply a little later. And I'm going to just define a bunch of these inputs. These are sort of defaults you can use. Sometimes you might have to tweak them depending on your workflow. And so I'm basically selecting the models that I had before. I'm selecting only the ocean surface temperature, only a subset of the members. So many of the models are run with sort of different initial conditions to quantify internal variability. And then I'm also looking at the area of cells in the ocean because they're not homogeneously contributed. So if we want to do a weighted average of the sea surface temperature, which is what I'm going to come up with at the end, we actually need the area of each of these finite grid cells. Just as sort of a, okay, this is fine. Good. That was actually good timing. We finally got some workers here, and hopefully going to see this going off in about, there we go. Okay, so it's loading a couple of data sets. Still takes a little bit, but it's like considerably less than if you would load this from, for instance, several netcdf files that are split in time, because you actually only have to access one metadata record per what we call data set. I'll talk about this a little bit later. We have to do the same thing for what I call the metrics, so the horizontal area of the cells. Just sort of as a little, and I'm just not going to execute this and talk about it because looking at a progress bar is boring. You don't need this intake ESM. Basically, all you need is this, well, this ZAR store. I should have printed that. I guess I have to execute it then. You basically just need the location of this ZAR store, and then you can use X-ray to just open that data set, and it gives you a rich representation of what that data set looks like. So you can see that this is sort of, the time goes from 1948 to 2014. So it's the whole experiment of the historical forcing that is prescribed by Siemens. You don't have to actually chunk together the time dimension. That is something that is already done by PANGEO. Okay, and then another step that we're going to do, that's also part of CMIP6 pre-processing, is sort of how to handle and combine different data sets into a data set that you can then analyze. So what we're basically doing here is just, we have two dictionaries of data sets, and we're just matching based on the metadata, the cell area, which is not provided, is sort of provided as a separate variable, to the best match in data sets. And then we're also concatenating members. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And then the output that we're going to see from this is sort of, you can see that the dimensionality was increased here. You can see that we now have 5 members. So we took 5 data sets and sort of concatenated them along a new dimension. And you also see that there's a new coordinate here called area cell O, which is the area that we need to do a weighted average at the end. And then that's really it. Then we can actually go into the analysis. And really in this code that I'm just going to execute, and it's going to take a little bit. I'm going to keep talking here. The code needed is really sort of this line here. That's the beauty of sort of X-ray. You're taking this, you're taking the variable out of the data set, you're weighing it with the area, and you're then computing a mean over the horizontal dimensions X and Y. And that's it. Everything else is really just sort of on top. I'm basically taking an annual average to make the output a little bit less noisy, and then sort of defining colors to make the plot nice. But this line here is all you need to do that analysis. And I still think that's incredibly cool. Maybe I should talk a little bit about X-ray. Like X-ray really is sort of this, I think, is poster child project of like how to really get everyone under the same roof that works with this type of data. And it's really a really active project. It has made tremendous sort of progress in the last couple of years that I've sort of watched it and contributed tiny things over time. But it's really worth checking out if you work with anything that resembles n-dimensional arrays, or if you work with netcdfs. Like I've not touched the actual netcdf library in Python for many years now, I think, like seriously. Okay, well, we're done. This is a plot of how many models do we have? Each color is basically a different model. These like thick lines are the average over members, and the thin lines are the single members. So you get an idea about sort of internal variability versus forced variability. And you can see that there's like different biases between these models, and they also have different increases in global temperature. And now is where the really fun part would start, where you as a scientist basically go in and sort of dig in and find out what's happening here, and which of these models performs better for what reason. But this is where I'm going to end, and just sort of say how much data did we just produce. We went through 47 gigabytes of data in a couple of minutes, and really sort of this is faster than downloading these data sets, or even a subset of these data sets. So just as a demo, how much faster you can really be with this. And a second point, you could just send this to a collaborator right now. I can send that to any one of you. And if you have basically, if you're on this platform, you just like copy that notebook, you can run the same thing and build on it. And that's really sort of the beauty of it. Let me try to switch back to my presentation. How am I doing on time? I can be quick with this. So I just wanted to go back to sort of the analysis-ready cloud optimized data. And again, sort of what does that actually mean? So it means that we're really thinking in scientifically useful units. Like oftentimes a file is sort of a necessity of a processing or a file system, but the useful unit is actually combining several files. And so the analysis-ready part is really sort of to get scientists that minimal unit they need and take the effort off them so they don't spend most of their time getting their data ready versus actually doing stuff with the data. It also means that the data is curated and cataloged so it can be easily discovered and accessed. So just as another example sort of ARCO data, what you see here is, again, an X-ray data set representation of a sea surface height data set. Again, it's a single object that you can interact with, which links to a ZAR store. And that ZAR store itself comprises of many chunks, which are actually stored in object store. But as a user, you don't actually need to know that. So if these backend complexities are conveniently hidden from the user, at least on the high level. The user gets a single data set with rich metadata to work on, and sort of the chunking, et cetera, are usually optimized for fast analysis. The cloud optimized part of ARCO really means that it's sort of compatible with object storage. It supports lazy operation and integrates with these high-level libraries, for instance, like Xarray or Pandas, and also distributed frameworks like Dask to really scale the analysis on large data sets if you have the compute available. There's just sort of one problem. Making ARCO data is really hard. Like there's the hard part that we all know is sort of the domain expertise. Like you need to know the data to actually clean it up. But then there's all these additional technical complexities if you want to bring it to the cloud. And I would just like to give a quick shout out to a project called PANGEO, which aims and is already able to make this a lot easier. So this is with PANGEO, scientists can create so-called recipes, and this is all sort of inspired by Conda Forge, to create ARCO data sets. These recipes encode how to download, combine, and process data sets. So they encode your domain expertise in this recipe, but then the recipe can be handed off to, for instance, a PANGEO cloud instance, that the bakery, as it's called, that then actually creates this data set in the cloud. You can also do that on your own computer, but like this is one of these sort of use cases that you know your data best, or even better, you get together with other people who use the data and sort of crowdsource and democratize the creation of ARCO data sets. Yeah, I cannot go in the full detail of PANGEO, but I definitely encourage you to check it out. It's not something I'm primarily involved with. Much of the work is done by Ryan Abernathy and Charles Stern in our group at Columbia. But I do think it's really a fantastic solution to a very common problem. I've used it myself, and it's really cool. And I think the idea here, sort of just to wrap that up, it really nicely intersects with this idea that I had with CMIP6 preprocessing, which I presented earlier. It's sort of the ideals of the PANGEO community is sort of you get all the experts on a certain topic together, and basically take all of that knowledge and package it up so that other scientists can actually use it in a simpler way. And if everybody does that, then everyone can access a variety of data sets much quicker and sort of enrich their science and really make their science better and faster. And yeah, that's it from me. I'd be happy to hear comments and answer questions either today or anytime, really, on GitHub or Twitter, wherever you want to find me. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. Any questions or any feedback? Sure, Lisa.
Thank you very much for that presentation. That was really great. And bravo for a live demo that worked. So congratulations on that. Throughout, I was kind of thinking about reproducible science. So what does the footnote to your computing look like, and how do you coach others to reproduce what you've done?
That's a very good question. I don't think I have a simple answer to that, but I think it all starts with the data really being accessible, right? Like, I feel like I've been, personally, as a scientist, I've been working backwards. All my recent papers are basically like, oh, I have like, I don't know, hundreds of gigabytes data set. Zenodo only allows me to upload 50 gigabytes, and I kind of don't want to like take up all of that space. You create these subset data sets, and then you just like expose everything from there on to the public in a GitHub repository, and that's reproducible. But really, a lot of the interesting parts are hidden in that part that is still running on some obscure HPC system. So I think getting that part out is sort of the first part. But then I think what's furthermore needed is sort of, and that's something I've been thinking about and working about, but I don't have like a really definitive solution to it yet, is a good way to define data pipelines. There's like many tools for that, but basically like once that data is exposed, I think notebooks are a fantastic tool to explore the data and share science. But I think that if you reach a certain maturity in your data set that you produce from another data set, there needs to be some sort of continuously integrated pipeline that converts data and puts it back in the cloud. So somebody else can just sort of take that. There's a DOI for that data set, and you can just say, this was published by blah, blah, blah et al. And I have that DOI, and this is what I use. And you just kind of put that, in an ideal world, you put that DOI in your Jupyter notebook, and you go from there. And you find something weird, you go back to that thing, to the other machinery, and actually look into it and say like, wait, actually there's an issue. And like, maybe then you can actually sort of have these more living data sets and even publications in the end. I feel that sort of that really, really benefit from a community aspect of working on it. I hope that answers the question somewhat, but
If no one else is going to leap in, I have another question. So you talked about having to clean data so that it can all work together. Of all of the myriad of players involved in the acquisition, archiving, and blah, blah, blah of data, which do you think should take the primary responsibility for standardizing metadata, for standardizing field formats, and so on? So all data associated with, ocean and space exploration or whatever talk well together.
That's another excellent question. And that is one that I think it does to some degree depend on the field. I think that in geosciences, we're actually somewhat lucky that there sort of are pretty good metadata specifications, like the CF conventions. And I think that it's just about sort of adhering to those. I think the current approach of PANGEO Forge is really sort of, it is the primary thing is not to create a data set, but it is sort of to take an already published data set and sort of don't transform the data, but maybe, modify the metadata, or like put it together in a certain way that it is really analysis ready. I think that in the end, the data provider still has responsibility to come up with that. But if you look at CMIP6 preprocessing, for instance, that kind of deviates from that a little bit, because a lot of these issues are initially not not known. And a lot of it is just sort of naming and metadata. Those are super quick fixes. So there's sort of this other idea where you could just community crowdsource fixes and agree on it. I mean, it's a progress, but I think in the end, there should always be some sort of democratic user-based input there. I think that in the end, all of the science is driven by users. People want to use the data. And I think in the end, they should have a big say in how the product that they want to work with on a day-to-day basis should actually look like. But again, it should be a democratic process, and there will be some compromises, obviously. But from what I've seen from the PANGEO community, these sort of compromises usually are not a roadblock. They're often just sort of an enrichment for a discussion and finding an even better general solution that serves pretty much everyone well. I hope that continues in the future.
I have a question. Julius, thanks for an excellent talk. Super interesting and important. I wanted to have two questions. Maybe I'll begin with, so what's the future in terms of hosting PANGEO and for, as an open system and including the data and so on? You mentioned how there's like a temporary solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's not sustainable at all right now, right? This is basically like there's sort of seed money that is burned through at the moment to sort of do this concept. So, I mean, in the end, this is a very open question, and I have an opinion on it, but I don't think that's necessarily sort of the truth or that represents some sort of consensus. I think that in the end, like science agencies will have to play a big role in there. Like somebody like NASA, for instance, and they're already, like, I've been in many discussions. There's some really promising directions that like people. So there's two sides there. There's the data and the compute, right? And you just kind of have to separate these two. I'm seeing a model where basically the data provider, someone like NASA, would sort of provide the data storage centrally on whichever provider they choose. That's a second layer of questions then, but then I think sort of I mean, if you think about it now, you would probably just apply for compute on the cloud on a grant, right? That just needs to be established as like a viable alternative to just putting in some HPC resources on your grant. I mean, in the end, that to me, that at least shouldn't make a big difference. But I know that there's like sort of there's usually some issues with like funding that because it doesn't actually go through the university, but and through like big companies like Amazon and Google. But in the end, I think that's sort of the model. I even see sort of I think a lot of people in the PANGEO community think of this sort of federated model as a successor, where you basically have a variety of organizations that provide compute and access these sort of big data stores that are provided by someone else, maybe the same person, but like generally could be a different entity. I personally think that having such a federation would be a nice way of like putting in what I would call a solidarity share or something. So where basically you just get a cloud deployment that provides compute with a grant. 20% of that is just completely open to the public. That might be completely naive of me right now, but I think it would be one of these things to sort of maintain, that would have obviously less compute resources, and maybe you can't spin up as many DAS clusters, but I think it would be phenomenal if sort of you could sponsor science, but also could sponsor everyone being able to access it, because I've seen a lot of people being like really interested in the PANGEO deployments right now. And you can do a lot of cool stuff with sort of minimal resources if it's just all open. But that's just sort of my point of view.
Yeah, I think those are excellent directions. It's another simple question is you mentioned, I think, how you can deploy, and I heard that's where you can deploy a PANGEO-like environment on, wherever. Can you explain that?
I mean, in the end, it's all openly documented in a variety of GitHub repositories. There's a varying level of complexity to it. I can basically tell you that I've set up sort of the PANGEO stack working on a Princeton HPC. It did take some work, not gonna lie. It wasn't like a 2-day job, but I basically created what I can do in the cloud on the Princeton HPC. not one-to-one, but it was like very comparable. I could probably take a notebook and with minimal changes, I can move it over. The other flip side of that is sort of the cloud deployments, that's significantly more complex. And I would encourage everyone to check out 2I2C, which is a nonprofit organization that sort of tries to bridge that gap for whichever entity wants to have a cloud deployment like this using these PANGEO tools, and in the end just kind of wants to pay for it, right? I think that's sort of a solution to like not everyone becoming an expert in cloud DevOps, and just having sort of a company that you can pay for this like you would maybe an IT people at the university or at a big HPC facility, and then you as a user just get your Jupyter Hub with like the resources you asked for, and you get billed for it. I think that's hopefully something that sort of will be more standard in the future.
So I think we are at the time, and so let's thanks Julius for the excellent talk.
Stop sharing.
And I hope it is okay to share the video, which I started a bit later, but
Absolutely.
we got the gist of the talk. So thank you again. We have a break until 11:25. So if you want to get, some bio break or things like that, please feel free to get away for 5 minutes and come back at 11:25.
Thank you, Julius.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm just going to post 2I2C in here just for everyone.
Okay.
I think that link I didn't have in there.
And do you have the slides with you, or?
Oh yeah, I can send it. Should I email them to you?
Yes, that will be great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Of course.
I wonder, and this is just off the record,